I need to get this out while it's fresh in my mind. I just experienced something that the authorities don't want getting to the public, and I needed somewhere to write this. If I sent my story to a news outlet, I figure it'd just get buried or written off. But then I remembered this subreddit. Some of the stories people tell here are more crazy and outlandish than mine, so I have a feeling no one will doubt me here. That's just a little backstory on why I'm posting this on some online forum instead of making this public, even though I do want to very urgently. People deserve to know what's out here in these mountains, and if this isn't brought to the attention of the media, many people may lose their life. I just wanted to make clear the urgency of this situation, even if you don't know what I saw. But what did I see? To tell you that, I need to tell you a bit of backstory. I grew up in the city, but I never liked living there. When I graduated college, I decided to move up to the mountains and get a job working for a logging company. I'd always seen those wilderness survival shows on the TV growing up, and I always wanted to be on one. Even tried to once, but they turned me away. My job pays very well, so I was able to buy 10 acres of land and build a cabin large enough to live comfortably and have guests over. The Wi-Fi and cell service aren't the best, but I don't use the internet that often, and cable is all I need for enjoying TV. I've lived here for 2 years now, and I've taken up hunting as a hobby. Of course, I don't just shoot the deer and leave it out wherever I shot it. I try to hunt for meals or to sell the meat to local buyers. Whenever I do bring home something, I have a footpath, which I erected by following it so often that the grass and weeds that used to grow there are all dead, replaced by dry dirt and the occasional protruding rock that you'd mess up your ankle on if you weren't paying attention. The path leads through a densely wooded area behind my house, out into a field of tall grass, through another, more winding forest area, and then out into a meadow where the tree line on the far side marks the end of my property. Once I get to the meadow, I set up station at the old trunk of a fallen tree. My side of the tree is littered with water and liquor bottles, along with some snack foods that I keep reminding myself to pick up, but always forget to every time I leave. I head out to my spot around dusk. Since I sleep in too late to go in the morning, I use my afternoon for work, and I like to get to sleep early, even though I know I'll still sleep in a few extra hours. I also like the scenery and the animals I can hear around me, crunching over dead leaves in the dense woods and scurrying around in the tall grass when I walk through the meadow. I've never been attacked by anything like a bear or a mountain lion, at least not until today. When I began my walk to the meadow after gearing up, I immediately felt that something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I only realize now that it was because I never heard any signs of wildlife coming from the woods or the tall grass. Hell, even the crickets weren't making any noise. I was unnerved, but that didn't stop me from reaching my hunting spot and setting up right as the sun was lowering behind the trees. It's funny, I've set up in the same spot every Wednesday for a year now, but the deer almost always pass through and forget that one of their kind died there a few days ago, maybe even their family members. Not to be morbid, of course, but it's pretty quiet out there, so I'm alone with my thoughts for 25 to 30 minutes. That's how long I stay in my spot. I mean, after that time frame it starts getting dark, so I pack up and head back if I get no action. That day started out boring. No signs of life for maybe 20 minutes, and I'm all out of snacks. Anyway, I lost hope of getting anything today, so I began to pack up. Just as I was disassembling my rifle, I saw a doe come dashing out of the tree line and into the meadow. I hurriedly reattached my scope and peered through it at the creature. It strode around the clearing for a moment, raising its head to the sky once or twice, then lowering it to the ground, stopping for a moment to sniff at the grass or whatever deer did. I'm no expert. I saw my opportunity and fired, the gunshot splitting the silence of the now starlit meadow. The deer cried out in pain, and I saw its form crumple to the ground, so I knew I'd hit it in a vital area. I try my best to put what I shot out of its misery as soon as possible, so I immediately jumped to my feet and grabbed my flashlight out of my backpack, clicking it on and making my way across the weeds and flowers of the clearing. I'd made it halfway to the fallen deer when I saw the trees rustle on the other side of the field. A buck with a giant set of antlers that twisted and curled above its head came dashing out of the tree line near the place the first deer had arrived. I clicked my flashlight off and dove to the ground, trying to make myself as unnoticeable as possible. I thought that maybe I hadn't shot a doe, but instead of fallen, and now the father had heard its cries and come to defend it. I felt bad for having shot a baby deer, but I also wasn't trying to put myself in a position where I could get impaled by the antlers of an angry buck. With my flashlight off, I could now only make out the silhouettes of the two animals. The fawn continued its wails of pain as the buck approached and craned its head down in a nuzzling motion towards its wounded comrade. I continued watching, breathing silently, as I saw the buck lift its head up and scan the area, almost as if checking for witnesses. I swear now that in that moment, the buck's eyes were glowing white, kind of like how a camera in the dark make things' eyes glow. What happened next is hard to describe. The buck changed. First it stood up on its hind legs, then its limbs began to stretch, elongating into human-like arms. The skin and tendons at its joints stretched, and eventually tore, unable to stretch over the thing's newly elongated limbs. Its form was more human-like now. It stood on its back legs, and dangled its front legs at its sides like arms, mangled, spindly arms, that leaned over the deer I had wounded, and the chewing began. I can best describe the sound as someone chewing a raw cut of steak as noisily and annoyingly as they could. I shivered at the sound, and what I realized was happening, and what I realized might happen if I didn't get out of that dark meadow and back to my home. I started backwards, crab shuffling away, the back of my pants getting hopelessly dirty, but I didn't care. All I cared about in that moment was putting distance between me and the thing I had thought was a harmless deer. I had crawled a few yards away when I backed into a protruding boulder. If I had cried out in that moment, this rock would have messed me up way worse than any little stone on a trail could have. But I kept my cool, inching along the jagged side of the boulder, my back pressed against it, never taking my gaze off the thing 30 yards away from me as I did so. That was why I stepped on the stick. I wasn't looking where I was stepping, and my foot came down on a twig, not so small you could snap it with your fingers, but small enough that a boot could snap it in half. As soon as that twig snapped, all noise stopped. No more chewing, not even the wind rustled the branches of the trees. I felt a sensation run down my spine like I never had before. I maybe felt a small fraction of it when I got called on to do a class presentation in middle school, or when I was watching a tense scene in a horror movie. But this was a different, pure unfiltered terror that came with the possibility of a gruesome death at the hands of a monster. I froze, forgetting to breathe as the monstrosity lifted its head and slowly turned it towards me, its glowing white eyes piercing through mine. I knew I was screwed when the thing stood up and turned its body towards me, beginning to shamble my way on its brutalized pair of legs. The limping slowly transformed into a flailing run straight for me, a sound somewhere in between that of a wounded deer call and a nightmarish screech emanated off every tree around, and that was what snapped me out of my trance. I remembered my sidearm on my right hip and drew it quicker than I ever knew I'd need to. I fumbled in the dark with the safety, every wasted second putting less and less space between me and the thing. I finally managed to flick the minuscule switch on the pistol's side and cocked back the hammer. I aimed and fired blindly, the flash of my shot lighting up the space in front of me like the flash on a camera, allowing me to see the horrible beast that I knew was going to kill me if I didn't act fast. It had bright pink gums and blood-soaked jagged teeth that still had bits of gore hanging from their tips. Its whole body looked to be rotting, with patches of skin missing, revealing the flesh, and in some places bone underneath. Its arms and legs hadn't changed in the sense that it still possessed hoof, but the knee and elbow joints were barely held together by bits of skin and tendon that had been nearly stretched to their limit, white bone visible through the mess of gore. Its eyes were indeed a milky white, and they glowed in the light like the stars above. I moved my aim higher, a little lower than where the head was last, and shot again, this time hearing the splatter of flesh and seeing the gaping hole between the eyes of the creature. When the flash revealed its grotesque form, now only feet away, it stumbled for a moment, then crumpled to the ground. I wasn't convinced it was dead though. If it could somehow disguise itself as a deer, then it could definitely play dead. I unloaded the rest of the ammo I had into its skull until it was riddled with blood dripping holes. I was hit with a wave of fatigue, call it exhaust from the adrenaline I felt, and I crumpled to the ground alongside it, I woke up to the sunlight shining in through my window, and I sat up immediately, realizing that I was lying in a field of grass, not my room. Unsurprisingly, the thing I had shot that night before was crumpled beside me. No matter how much I could have tried to convince myself that what I experienced was a dream, it would be pointless. My pistol lay discarded on the ground to my other side, and I remembered that I had probably dropped it when I had fainted. Packing up my supplies and retrieving my flashlight from where I hadn't realized I'd left it, I decided to go home, call the sheriff, and come back out with him at dusk. It takes a while to get to my property from town, so I took a shower and performed all my usual morning tasks before hearing a knock at my front door. The sheriff was there, looking at me expectantly. He asked to see the animal I'd shot, so I took him out to the clearing where I don't plan on returning to anytime soon, and showed him the dead thing. I know the sheriff well. Me and him have talked many times before, not serious talks about how fast I was going on the highway, but more friendly talks about life and plans for the future. He had always seemed to me like the type to be unfazed if a bullet flew inches away from his head, but I saw terror in his eyes as he looked at that thing's body. I also took him over to the doe, and it was a doe that I had wounded. Its stomach had been torn open, intestines flowing out of the gaping hole in its stomach. A pained look was still plastered on the face of its corpse. It looked like the work of a bear or mountain lion, but me and the sheriff both knew what had done this. When we arrived back at my cabin, he made a phone call that to me sounded like a general calling in reinforcements. In a sense, he did. 20 minutes later, 4 black SUVs rumbled up the dirt road to my cabin, and people streamed out of them. Most were in biohazard suits, but there were 2 men in matte black business suits. As the men in biohazard suits approached the sheriff, I noted the letters SCP written in white on their backs. The sheriff pointed to the path at the back of my house and said a few things I couldn't hear before the men grabbed their gear and streamed off down the trail. The men in the business suits approached the sheriff and began speaking with him a ways away. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the sheriff looked worried, taking off his hat and running a hand through his hair. I decided to join the conversation and walked over to the trio conversing. As I got closer, I caught a piece of what one of the men said. Can't have the risk of people knowing about this. It could cause panic. They heard me and turned to face me, staring me down as if I was to blame for something. You're a very lucky man. Your friend here convinced us to let you live, one of them said in an accusatory tone. I stopped in my tracks as they continued. Usually we'd take the precaution in order to prevent information from leaking to the public, but we trust that you'll be better than that. The man's tone heavily implied that I should keep my mouth shut about the whole situation, or some happy little accident might happen where I end up tripping down the stairs, or accidentally slipping onto a counter and hitting my head hard enough that I die of head trauma. I nodded once, and that was all the men needed. That and the fact that the men in the biohazard costumes came trotting back out of the woods with a black bag marked Anomaly 8978 on its side, its shape suspiciously resembling that of a body. All the men filed back into the vans and did a U-turn back down my driveway and out of sight. Me and the sheriff parted ways, him giving me a reminder to keep my mouth shut about all of this. Well, I've gone and done it now, because here I am. I still don't know a lot of things, like what that thing in the clearing was, who those men were, or why they made death threats to me in order to keep me quiet. But I do know one thing though, and it'll probably be enough to keep me, and many others, safe. I'm not going hunting again in these mountains anytime soon, because there are monsters that roam these woods when the sun sets, and no one should be around to gaze upon them. There are monsters in these woods, and they look like deer.